On November 30th, 1943, in the basement of the Soviet embassy in Tehran, Iran, Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov's hand froze mid-signature on an operational report. His pen hovered above words that would never grace an official Soviet document. Without the 400,000 trucks we are receiving from the Americans, this offensive would be impossible, he mused. We are moving our armies on American wheels. Through the embassy window, he heard the distant hum of American-made Studebaker engines traversing Tehran's streets, carrying Soviet provisions for the impending conference where Stalin would meet Roosevelt and Churchill. In that profound moment, the Red Army's most esteemed commander grappled with a truth destined to remain sealed in classified archives for nearly half a century. The very force pushing the Wehrmacht back towards Berlin was propelled by American trucks, fueled by American gasoline, and sustained by American provisions. As Stalin himself would confess in a private toast mere hours later, without this vital aid, the Soviet Union would have succumbed to defeat. 427,284 American trucks and jeeps traversed treacherous Arctic convoys, the Persian Corridor, and the Pacific route, ultimately reaching Soviet hands. This sheer volume of vehicles surpassed the Soviet Union's entire wartime production and dwarfed the combined holdings of most nations. These machines fundamentally reshaped the Red Army, transforming it from a force constrained by the pace of marching men and horses into a mechanized juggernaut capable of sustaining operations across thousand-mile fronts. What the Soviet officers present that day in Tehran could not have foreseen was that their candid admissions regarding American assistance were being meticulously documented, not only by American stenographers, but also by their own NKVD operatives, forging a secret record that would directly challenge decades of Soviet propaganda concerning the Great Patriotic War. The narrative of Soviet transportation's inadequacy began with catastrophe. On June 22, 1941, 3,800,000 Axis soldiers surged across the Soviet frontier in Operation Barbarossa. They encountered a Red Army woefully unprepared for mechanized warfare. The Soviet truck fleet, numbering approximately 700,000 vehicles, consisted mainly of the Gaz AA, a licensed replica of the 1930 Ford Model A, and the ZIS-5, based on American designs from the 1920s. Within 6 months, 40% of this fleet lay destroyed or captured. The stark figures exposed an industrial deficiency that Soviet propaganda would strive for decades to conceal. In 1941, the Soviet Union produced a mere 124,176 trucks, while losing nearly 300,000. The Gaz factory in Gorky, the nation's principal truck manufacturer, was evacuated eastward as German forces advanced, drastically curtailing production. The ZIS factory in Moscow was repurposed for tank production as the Wehrmacht stood at the city's gates. By early 1942, entire Soviet armies marched on foot, their artillery pulled by horses when horses could even be found. The Second Shock Army, encircled in the Demyansk pocket, lost 95% of its transport attempting to break free. Soldiers carried ammunition on their backs for artillery pieces they could no longer move. This was the Red Army that American aid would ultimately revolutionize, though it would take Soviet leaders 40 years to publicly acknowledge this transformation. The Wehrmacht's mechanized spearheads had starkly demonstrated the requirements of modern warfare: mobility, speed, and dependable logistics. Soviet forces, despite numerical superiority in many areas, found themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered and encircled due to their inability to match German mobility. Infantry divisions that should have been motorized marched on foot. Artillery batteries that required prime movers relied on horses that perished by the thousands in the harsh Russian winter. On October 1, 1941, at Arkhangelsk port on the Soviet Arctic coast, the British convoy PQ-1 discharged its vital cargo under the dim light of the Arctic autumn. 20 American trucks, the very first of an impending deluge, rolled onto Soviet soil. These Chevrolets, with their enclosed cabs and reliable engines, seemed miraculous to Soviet drivers accustomed to vehicles demanding hours of maintenance for every hour of operation. By November 1941, with the Wehrmacht a mere 12 miles from the Kremlin, American trucks were arriving at a rate of 2,000 per month through various routes. The Persian Corridor, managed by American engineers who had assumed control of the Iranian State Railway, saw its capacity increase by 600%. The Pacific route, though restricted to non-military supplies due to Soviet-Japanese neutrality, still facilitated the movement of thousands of vehicles. The perilous Arctic convoys, despite significant losses to U-boat and Luftwaffe attacks, persisted in delivering their precious cargo. The vehicles themselves represented a technological leap that Soviet mechanics could scarcely comprehend. The Studebaker US-6 boasted six-wheel drive, with all six wheels powered, a stark contrast to Soviet trucks, which had only four wheels with just two powered. Its engine produced 94 horsepower compared to the ZYS-573. Most crucially, the American trucks were equipped with self-recovery winches, enabling them to extricate themselves from mud that would immobilize Soviet vehicles until spring. These trucks arrived fully outfitted with tools previously unknown to Soviet forces, comprehensive 128-piece toolkits, hydraulic jacks, tire repair equipment, and spare parts catalogs with numbered components. A typical Soviet truck, if it came with tools at all, had only basic hand tools. The Americans had anticipated every need, including cold-weather starting equipment, effective cabin heaters, and sealed electrical systems resistant to moisture. The Tehran Conference, held from November 28 to December 1, 1943, yielded one of the most extraordinary admissions in Soviet history. Although it would remain classified in American archives until 1961 and unpublished in the Soviet Union until 1989. During a private dinner on November 30th, attended only by Roosevelt, Churchill, and their closest advisors, Stalin rose to propose a toast that directly contradicted everything Soviet propaganda would assert for the ensuing half-century. According to Charles Bolin, Roosevelt's interpreter, Stalin declared, "I want to tell you what from the Russian point of view, the President and the United States have done for victory in this war. The most important things in this war are the machines. The United States has proven that it can turn out from 8,000 to 10,000 airplanes per month. Russia can only turn out at most 3,000 airplanes a month. The United States, therefore, is a country of machines. Without the machines we received through Lend-Lease, we would have lost the war." General Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, recorded in his diary that Stalin had specifically highlighted trucks during the subsequent technical discussions. The Soviet leader asserted that the American Studebakers were the finest trucks in the world for their conditions and hailed them as the bedrock of Soviet mobility. Yet, a mere 3 years later, in 1946, Stalin would publicly declare that Lend-Lease had been merely supplementary, constituting only about 10% of Soviet production. This fabrication evolved into Soviet dogma, enforced by censors and historians who, though aware of the truth, prioritized their careers and lives over historical accuracy. The Tehran Conference records also revealed other crucial admissions. Marshal Clement Voroshilov informed American logistics officers, "Your trucks are winning the war for us. One American truck is worth 10 light tanks to us." This statement came from a military leader who publicly attributed victory solely to Soviet industry. To comprehend the decisive impact of American trucks, one must grasp the arithmetic of Soviet logistics. A single Soviet rifle division engaged in an offensive required 450 tons of supplies daily: ammunition, food, fuel, and medical provisions. In defense, it needed 300 tons. A tank corps demanded 1,000 tons. Transporting these supplies from railheads to the front lines across the Soviet Union's rudimentary road network necessitated trucks. Major General Andrei Krylyov, chief of Soviet military logistics, compiled statistics in 1943 that remained classified until 1991. His report unveiled stark mathematical realities. The Red Army required a minimum of 450,000 trucks for offensive operations. Soviet production from January to September 1943 totaled a mere 49,000 vehicles. American deliveries during the same period reached 94,000 vehicles. Without American vehicles, Soviet forces could not operate beyond 50 kilometers from rail lines. The qualitative difference was as significant as the quantity. Soviet trucks, primarily the ZIS-5 and GAZAAA, possessed cargo capacities of 2.5 to 3 tons, but rarely carried more than 1.5 tons on rough roads without breakdown. American Studebaker US-6s, rated at 2.5 tons, routinely hauled 5 tons on good roads and 3 tons cross-country. Their mean time between failures was 10,000 kilometers, compared to 2,000 for Soviet trucks. The mechanical superiority extended beyond reliability. American trucks incorporated innovations that Soviet designers had not conceived. Air brakes functional in all weather, aluminum pistons reducing engine weight, oil filters that genuinely filtered, and thermostats maintaining optimal engine temperature. Soviet trucks featured mechanical brakes that failed when wet, cast iron pistons, settling tanks that rarely functioned, and engines that ran too cold in winter and overheated in summer. While the Arctic convoys captured the public imagination with their desperate battles against U-boats, the Persian Corridor quietly emerged as the primary conduit for American trucks reaching Soviet forces. This 4,000-mile supply line, stretching from American ports through Iran to the Soviet border, represented one of the most significant logistical achievements in military history. American engineers transformed Iran's primitive infrastructure within months. They inherited a single-track railway capable of moving 200 tons daily and increased its capacity to 6,000 tons. They constructed highways where only camel trails had existed. They established assembly plants in the desert capable of processing 300 trucks daily. The truck assembly plant at Andameshk became a symbol of American industrial might. Transplanted to the Middle East, Soviet drivers, after arduous journeys from the Caucasus, would receive 3 days of training on American vehicles before driving their new trucks 1,800 kilometers back to the front. The cultural shock was profound. Soviet soldiers accustomed to vehicles requiring constant repairs now commanded machines that simply functioned. By mid-1943, the Persian Corridor was delivering thousands of trucks monthly. The port of Khorramshahr, which had handled 50,000 tons annually before the war, was processing 250,000 tons per month. American efficiency astonished Soviet liaison officers who reported to Moscow on dock operations that unloaded ships in 48 hours, tasks that took Soviet ports 2 weeks. The total number of vehicles delivered via this route reached tens of thousands, with estimates suggesting nearly half of all American trucks reached the Soviet Union through Iran. The corridor operated with an efficiency that Soviet logistics officers studied and attempted to replicate, though they lacked the industrial infrastructure to match American methods. The union of American trucks with Soviet rocket artillery spawned one of World War II's most formidable weapons. The BM-13 Katyusha rocket launcher had originally been mounted on ZIS-6 trucks, but production of this vehicle ceased in late 1941. The few rail-mounted and towed versions proved almost useless in mobile warfare. The Studebaker US-6 changed everything. Its reinforced chassis could withstand the violent recoil of a full rocket salvo. Its 6-wheel drive enabled it to fire and relocate before German counter-battery fire arrived. The Studebaker's cross-country performance was so superior that it became the standardized mount in 1943. Designated the BM-13N. Over 1,800 of these standardized Studebaker-mounted systems were manufactured by war's end. Guard formations equipped with Studebaker-mounted Katyushas achieved survival rates 400% higher than those utilizing Soviet vehicles. The ability to shoot and scoot, firing a salvo and relocating within 3 minutes, depended entirely on reliable vehicles. Soviet trucks, when they functioned at all, required 15 minutes for the same maneuver. The psychological impact matched the physical devastation. German soldiers dubbed them Stalin's organs, but noted they rode on American trucks. The standardization on American chassis revolutionized Soviet rocket artillery logistics, introducing a single manual, one set of parts, and one type of training, replacing the improvisation that characterized earlier efforts. The production mathematics paint a clear picture. Analyzing production statistics reveals the mathematical impossibility of Soviet victory without American trucks. Soviet vehicle production during the war totaled approximately 1941, 46,100 vehicles from June 22, 1942, 32,300 vehicles, 1943, 41,600 vehicles, 1944, 57,400 vehicles, and 1945, 27,600 vehicles through May. Total wartime Soviet truck production reached approximately 205,000 units, less than half the American contribution of 427,284 vehicles. Against this, losses were catastrophic, with nearly 300,000 vehicles lost in 1941 alone, and continued losses throughout the war totaling over 500,000 vehicles. Without American deliveries, the Soviet vehicle park would have dwindled to nothing by mid-1942. Every Soviet offensive after Stalingrad was contingent on American wheels. By 1945, American-built vehicles constituted 33% of the Red Army's total vehicle fleet, but accounted for 70% of its actual transport capacity due to their superior carrying capability and reliability. The economic dimension was equally critical. A single Studebaker US-6 cost $1,830 to produce in 1943. The Soviet Union received them free through Lend-Lease. To produce equivalent vehicles domestically would have cost the Soviet Union approximately $800 million in 1943, resources desperately needed for tank and aircraft production in addition to industrial capacity the USSR simply lacked. Operation Bagration, launched on June 23, 1944, definitively demonstrated that American trucks had transformed Soviet operational capability. This massive offensive, which annihilated German Army Group Center and inflicted 450,000 casualties, would have been impossible without American vehicles. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's operational planning underscored this mathematical dependency. His first Belarusian front required 12,000 tons of supplies daily. Soviet railways could deliver to depots 60 to 100 kilometers behind the lines. From there, only trucks could sustain the advance. Rokossovsky had 19,000 trucks, 14,000 of which were American. The speed of advance, 450 kilometers in 5 weeks, overwhelmed German planning, which assumed Soviet forces would require operational pauses every 100 to 150 kilometers to re-establish logistics. Wehrmacht intelligence had calculated Soviet offensive capability based on Soviet truck production, unaware that American vehicles had tripled the Red Army's transport capacity. During Bagration's 5 weeks, American trucks in Soviet service transported 400,000 tons of ammunition, 300,000 tons of food, and evacuated 250,000 wounded. They consumed 67,000 tons of fuel, itself delivered largely by other American trucks. Soviet truck production for the entirety of 1944 could not have sustained the offensive for even 1 week. The contrast with earlier operations was stark. The failed Second Battle of Kharkiv in May 1942 had stalled, partly because Soviet forces outran their logistics within days. By 1944, with American trucks, Soviet forces could maintain offensive momentum for weeks, transforming tactical victories into strategic triumphs. Marshal Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most celebrated commander, left 3 separate testimonies regarding American aid that remained hidden until the Soviet collapse. Each testimony provided details that dismantled the myth of Soviet self-sufficiency. The first emerged from KGB surveillance transcripts. In 1963, during a private conversation at his dacha, unaware of hidden microphones, Zhukov stated, "People say that the Allies didn't help us, but it cannot be denied that the Americans sent us material without which we could not have formed our reserves or continued the war. Without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with." The second testimony came in interviews with writer Konstantin Simonov between 1965 and 1966. Tape recordings that remained suppressed until 1990 captured Zhukov's explicit words. "Without American studies, we could have dragged our artillery nowhere. To a considerable degree, they provided our front transport. The third account appeared in Zhukov's unpublished manuscript, seized in 1969 and locked in archives until 1992. Analyzing the Battle of Berlin, Zhukov wrote about the critical importance of American trucks in delivering 2.2 million artillery shells in 2 weeks, and feat possible only with American vehicles making continuous supply runs. Nikita Khrushchev's secretly recorded memoirs, smuggled to the West in 1970, contained perhaps the most comprehensive admission of Soviet dependence on American aid. His testimony was authenticated through voice analysis and corroborated by other sources after the Soviet collapse. I would like to express my candid opinion about Stalin's views on whether the Red Army and the Soviet Union could have coped with Nazi Germany and survived the war without aid from the United States and Britain, Khrushchev stated. He declared bluntly that if the United States had not helped them, they would not have won the war. If we had had to fight Nazi Germany one-on-one, we could not have stood up against Germany's pressure, and we would have lost the war. Khrushchev specifically addressed trucks. No one talks about this officially, and Stalin never, I think, left any written traces of his opinion, but I can say that he expressed this view several times in conversations with me. Our losses would have been colossal because we would have had no maneuverability. This same Khrushchev, as Soviet premier, would publicly declare that the Soviet Union achieved victory through its own resources, a contradiction epitomizing Soviet schizophrenia regarding American aid. Soviet mechanics who maintained American trucks understood the technological chasm between American and Soviet automotive engineering. American engines utilized aluminum pistons, Soviet engines employed heavy cast iron. American trucks featured oil filters, Soviet trucks relied on settling tanks. American vehicles boasted sealed wheel bearings with a lifespan of 50,000 kilometers. Soviet bearings lasted 5,000, if fortunate. The spare parts system astounded Soviet mechanics. Americans provided catalogs detailing every part with numerical identifiers. Order by number, and the exact part arrived. The Soviet system involved cannibalizing broken vehicles or fabricating parts by hand. American trucks included safety features. Soviet designers had never considered safety. Glass, mirrors on both sides, backup lights, or horns operable with one hand. Beyond the immediate military impact, American trucks revolutionized Soviet automotive thinking. Soviet engineers studying American vehicles gleaned lessons that influenced post-war Soviet truck design for decades. The ZIS-150, the Soviet Union's first post-war mass-produced truck, was essentially a Soviet interpretation of American design principles learned from Studebakers. American trucks introduced a maintenance culture previously unknown in Soviet practice: preventive maintenance schedules, systematic inspections, and part standardization. These concepts originated directly from the study of American vehicles and would shape Soviet industrial development for a generation. The Soviet failure in the 1939–40 Winter War against Finland had exposed catastrophic logistical weaknesses. Unable to supply troops a mere 150 kilometers from Leningrad, the Red Army suffered 126,875 dead and 264,980 wounded against Finnish forces 1/10 its size. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko's post-war analysis identified truck shortages as a critical factor. Soviet forces possessed numerical superiority but could not concentrate due to transport limitations. By 1944, American automotive transports had successfully resolved the logistical challenges previously encountered in Finland. The Soviet offensive launched against Finnish forces in June of 1944 achieved its objectives precisely because American vehicles ensured the continuity of supply lines across terrain that had, just 4 years prior, thwarted Soviet logistical capabilities. Soviet propaganda frequently asserted that rail networks, rather than motor vehicles, were the linchpin of their supply operations, thereby diminishing the significance of American automotive contributions. Declassified studies from the Soviet General Staff elucidate the impossibility of such a claim. During their withdrawal, German forces dismantled 65,000 kilometers of railway track, 13,000 bridges, and 4,100 railway stations. While Soviet railway repair units could reconstruct approximately 20 kilometers of track daily under combat conditions, the restored single-track lines could accommodate only 6 to 8 trains per diem, a stark contrast to the 40 to 50 trains that utilized intact double-track routes. More critically, railway transport terminated at fixed locations. The final 50 to 100 kilometers to the combat units necessitated the use of trucks. The absence of these vehicles would have meant no supplies reaching the front lines. The Germans learned this lesson to their severe detriment. Their exceptional railway engineers initially kept pace with the advancing Red Army, but a dearth of trucks led to the accumulation of supplies at railheads, rendering them useless as fighting formations experienced severe shortages of ammunition. Although Studebaker trucks captured the Soviet imagination, the full spectrum of American-supplied vehicles proved equally indispensable. The 51,500 Willys Jeeps fundamentally altered reconnaissance and command operations. The 69,000 Dodge 3/4-ton trucks provided crucial tactical mobility for infantry platoons, while 47,000 Chevrolet 1.5-ton vehicles served as the workhorses of divisional logistics. Marshal Ivan Konv noted that Jeeps facilitated real-time battlefield command, enabling commanders to visit multiple divisions daily, thereby accelerating the decision-making cycle and conferring a decisive advantage. The systematic suppression of acknowledgments regarding Lend-Lease assistance commenced even before the cessation of hostilities. In February of 1945, the State Defense Committee issued Secret Order No. 7572, mandating the censorship of all photographic depictions of foreign military equipment from public dissemination. The narrative was established that Soviet industry alone was responsible for the victory. This directive initiated a 40-year campaign to expunge American trucks from Soviet historical accounts of the war. Photographic retouchers airbrushed American vehicles from images, replacing them with Soviet counterparts. Film footage featuring American trucks was either edited or destroyed. Memoirs penned by war veterans were subjected to censorship to eliminate any references to foreign material. This suppression extended to statistical data. The official Soviet historical account published in 1960 claimed that Lend-Lease constituted a mere 4% of Soviet wartime production. This figure was arrived at through manipulative accounting practices that compared American deliveries to the entirety of Soviet output, including civilian goods, and employed ruble valuations that undervalued American equipment. When veterans submitted personal accounts mentioning American vehicles, editorial staff systematically substituted these specific references with generalized terms. For instance, Studebaker became truck, and American vehicles were rendered as our vehicles. Entire passages were rewritten to entirely remove any suggestion of foreign assistance. As Cold War tensions escalated, this suppression intensified. By 1948, Nikolai Voznesensky, a member of the Politburo, issued reports asserting that Lend-Lease comprised nearly 4% of Soviet production, while simultaneously denouncing the United States as the leader of the anti-democratic bloc. This became the officially sanctioned narrative for 4 decades. Soviet historians aware of the truth faced an insurmountable dilemma: perpetuate falsehoods or jeopardize their careers. The majority opted for self-preservation, producing historical accounts that attributed victory solely to Soviet industrial prowess. This distortion permeated educational systems. Soviet schoolchildren were taught that their nation had single-handedly defeated Hitler. Museums displayed captured German armaments but concealed American vehicles. War memorials lauded Soviet tanks without ever acknowledging the trucks that transported vital ammunition to the front. Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost finally paved the way for candid discourse. In 1989, the Military History Journal published transcripts from the Tehran Conference, revealing Stalin's candid admission. The repercussions were profound. Readers discovered that their entire understanding of the war had been constructed upon a foundation of deception. Veterans finally came forward with unvarnished truths. At a reunion in Moscow in 1990, former truck drivers stood and recounted their experiences with American vehicles, sharing stories that had been suppressed for 45 years. Revelations from archival sources were astonishing. researchers uncovered dual accounting systems, one set of figures for internal planning and another, falsified set for public consumption. The authentic data indicated that American trucks constituted 70% of Soviet transportation capacity by 1945. Dr. Boris Suloev, after examining newly accessible archives, definitively concluded that the Soviet military and every offensive operation after Stalingrad would have failed without the contribution of American trucks. The Red Army marched to Berlin utilizing American footwear and transported by American trucks. The Battle of Berlin, fought in April and May of 1945, served as the ultimate demonstration of the pivotal role played by American trucks. The logistical demands were immense. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers and 41,600 artillery pieces required constant resupply across the devastated German landscape. Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front alone necessitated 25,000 tons of supplies daily. His logistical network comprised 22,000 trucks, 16,000 of which were American. The expenditure of ammunition, amounting to 2.5 million artillery shells in the initial week, required trucks to undertake continuous journeys under enemy fire. Each American truck completed an average of 4 supply runs daily, covering a 100-kilometer round trip. Soviet trucks, when operational, managed only 1 run before experiencing breakdowns. Even in the moment of triumph, reliance persisted. The victory parade through Berlin was conducted using American vehicles, chosen for their presentable condition and superior reliability. Soviet forces conquered Hitler's capital riding in trucks provided by Roosevelt. The comprehensive accounting of American aid, finally revealed following the Soviet Union's dissolution, was staggering. Vehicle deliveries alone included 427,284 trucks and jeeps, 13,330 combat vehicles, 35,170 motorcycles, and 2,328 ordnance service vehicles. Supporting materials encompassed 2.7 million tons of petroleum products, 4.5 million tons of food, 15.4 million pairs of boots, 1,911 steam locomotives, and 11,075 railroad cars. The vehicle deliveries alone surpassed the total number of trucks produced by Germany throughout the entire war, providing sufficient transport capacity to fully mechanize 60 rifle divisions. By the war's conclusion, American vehicles had transported 60% of all ammunition, moved 70% of all fuel, evacuated 65% of all casualties, percent of wounded soldiers, and towed 58% of artillery pieces. In the immediate post-war period, appreciative Soviet officials proposed the erection of monuments commemorating American assistance. Marshal Zhukov suggested a memorial to the Allied arsenal of democracy. The Communist Party rejected all such proposals. For 45 years, no monument acknowledged the crucial role of American trucks. It was not until 2004 that a modest Lend-Lease memorial was unveiled in Murmansk. Even then, controversy ensued. The absence of monuments reflected a more profound tragedy, the theft of historical memory. Millions of Soviet citizens grew up believing their nation had defeated Hitler independently. As the last surviving veterans pass away, their testimonies are transforming into invaluable historical documents. At a gathering in Moscow in 2005, the remaining drivers formed the Studebaker Brotherhood, dedicated to preserving the authentic history. They collected photographs hidden for 60 years, depicting American vehicles adorned with Soviet insignia. Their final declaration, signed by 200 veterans, stated, "We rode American trucks to victory. We consumed American food. We fired American ammunition. This does not diminish the Soviet sacrifice. 27 million of our people perished. However, truth honors their memory far better than lies. American trucks were instrumental in saving our motherland. Today, as Russia once again revises World War II history for political objectives, the Lend-Lease narrative holds renewed significance." Contemporary Russian textbooks downplay American aid even more than their Soviet predecessors, as part of a broader initiative to bolster national pride through historical mythology. Nevertheless, the mathematical realities remain unaltered. The documented delivery of 427,284 American vehicles more than double the Soviet wartime production of 205,000 trucks, cannot be erased. The testimonies of Stalin, Khrushchev, and Zhukov, preserved in numerous archives, cannot be invalidated. This truth serves as a potent reminder that international cooperation, rather than isolation, was the decisive factor in defeating fascism. The American trucks that transported Soviet soldiers to victory were products of democracy's arsenal, freely shared with an ally despite ideological disparities. The narrative of American trucks in Soviet service transcends mere military logistics. It exemplifies how industrial capacity triumphs in modern warfare, how ideology distorts historical truth, and how verity ultimately prevails despite concerted efforts at suppression. The 427,284 American trucks and jeeps that reached the Soviet Union represented the crucial difference between victory and defeat on the Eastern Front. They transformed the Red Army from a World War I-style force reliant on railways and horses into a mechanized army capable of sustained offensive operations across vast continental distances. Soviet leaders were privy to this truth. Stalin admitted at Tehran that without American machinery, we would have lost the war. Zhukov confessed that without American trucks, Soviet forces wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with. Khrushchev acknowledged that without American aid, the Soviet Union could not have withstood German pressure. Yet, for 45 years, the Soviet Union perpetuated a fabricated historical account. Photographs were doctored, memoirs censored, and statistics manipulated. The Communist Party deprived its populace of the genuine history of their victory, substituting it with a mythology that served political ends but dishonored historical accuracy. Only with the advent of glasnost did the complete truth emerge from archives, recordings, and personal testimonies. The evidence conclusively demonstrated that American trucks did not merely augment the Soviet war effort, they were its enabling force. The Studebakers, affectionately dubbed zakhodnik by Soviet soldiers, meaning go anywhere, were as integral to victory as the T-34 tanks celebrated in every memorial. The suppression and subsequent revelation of this truth offer lessons extending beyond military history. They illustrate how authoritarian regimes manipulate collective memory, how political expediency overrides factual accuracy, and how truth ultimately surfaces despite official efforts to bury it. Today, the irrefutable mathematical fact persists. Soviet forces entered Berlin in triumph aboard American trucks. The arsenal of democracy vanquished the Wehrmacht not solely through weaponry, but through its wheels, 427,184 of them, traversing oceans and continents to carry the Red Army to its ultimate victory. The American trucks that revolutionized the Red Army symbolize more than mere machinery. They represent how the productive might of industrial democracy, willingly shared even with ideological adversaries, proved decisive in humanity's struggle against fascism. The Soviet generals who admitted they would have been defeated without American trucks spoke a truth that transcends political boundaries. Modern conflicts are not won by courage alone, but by the synergistic union of bravery and industrial power. Ultimately, the robust Studebakers that endured decades of Soviet service outlasted the fabrications disseminated about them. The veterans bore witness. The documents provided irrefutable proof, and history now records. Without American trucks, there would have been no Soviet victory. The wheels of the arsenal of democracy carried not only essential supplies, but also the collective aspirations of nations striving for triumph over tyranny. The ultimate irony lies in the fact that American generosity fostered the very Soviet power that would subsequently spend 45 years denying America's contribution. Yet, truth, much like those dependable American engines, endures beyond the reach of political manipulation. The Soviet generals were correct. They would have been defeated without approximately 400,000 American trucks.